Point number 6, sometimes things do not go your way, or we could even say the expectation versus the reality. So there were a lot of expectations that I had going into the podcast, where I thought it was going to be very easy to get particular guests because of a particular history that I had with them, knowing them and working with them. That was the one thing. And I thought also, wow, I know that I do great interviews, so why will this be a challenge? That did not happen. So that was the one thing that I learned, is that when it comes to your guest list, sometimes it's going to change. In fact, the list that I had at the beginning of the podcast to the list that actually made the podcast before I was clear on the vision of the podcast is totally different, and I'm absolutely happy that it worked the way that it did, because I feel as though the guests that I was able to get eventually, because I was open and because things had not actually gone my way, turned out to be the best kind of cast for the first season of the podcast. And I've gotten great reviews just from the things that people have been able to learn from them. So that was really a blessing in disguise. Also, sometimes things not going your own way means that you can wake up in the morning and be really like unwell, or perhaps you've had like a really bad situation that has happened. But the challenge about having a podcast where you're basically a startup, which is what my podcast is that once you get a guest, you've got the guest. It's very difficult to say, oh, great, thank you so much for your time, Akina Montoso, but can we do the interview another day because I'm not feeling well? No matter how much Akin wants to do the interview, he's extremely busy and he's got a lot of things going on. So I found that with some of the podcasts, well, there were 2 actually where I was unwell. There was one podcast in particular with Theo Boloi from Batu Sneakers, and I was really so unwell that I could not even move. But I ended up doing the podcast because I realized that he even made time for me to be able to do the podcast. So in that case, from a physical perspective, things were not going my way, but it turned out to be a great conversation. So there's that aspect that happens as well. So when you're doing a podcast, because it's life, we're humans, you can feel unwell, something can go wrong. Technically, we had a podcast episode, as I mentioned before, where technically everything had disappeared, but it ended up being amazing because it created a new format for that kind of guest on the podcast. So sometimes things don't go the way that you plan, but if your intent is pure and your heart and your mind behind it is really focused, you'll find a way that really all things will work together for the good of the podcast. And I really am blessed because that is what happened. I may have lost a lot along the way, but I gained 100,000 more in this journey of the podcast.
The Africa Whisperer, Lee Kasumba, telling authentic African stories from a global perspective.